You want to finish what you started? You came to the right place. Them girls that you came with, you might have to part with. Depending on how this thing shakes. Wauwatosa, Kenosha, is in the house.
Okay, welcome to another episode of the New Look podcast, where we are going to be taking a new look at all things Latin America with a Wisconsinite, no less, Ryan Berg. Ryan, welcome. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on the pod.
Ryan, let's start with the most important question. Where are you from?
From just outside of Milwaukee in the great state of Wisconsin, about 25 minutes out, a small town called Heartland, near Delafield, Pewaukee area.
Where'd you go to high school?
I went to Arrowhead High School.
Wow. So at a young age, as a young Wisconsinite, did you always have an interest in the world outside of Wisconsin? Is there a moment where you felt like, hey, maybe I'm going to devote my life to studying foreign policy? How did that take hold?
Yeah, I was always curious from a young age. I was always interested in geography in other countries and how they conducted their affairs with other countries. I think for me, the real moment when I decided I wanted to dedicate my professional life to studying foreign policy came as I was studying in undergraduate at Georgetown University. I really just got bitten by the political bug. It was probably a combination of being in Washington and working some internships, including up on the Hill for, at the time, he was just a congressman, Paul Ryan. He wasn't yet Speaker of the House or any of that. In fact, the Republicans were at the time in the minority. So it's through a series of internships and undergrad study, I think I got bitten by the political bug and specifically by the foreign policy bug.
Before we get to your time in DC, I'm looking up all sorts of things about Arrowhead High School. I'm trying to find the mascot. I don't know the mascot. What was the mascot?
It's Wally the Warhawk.
Wally the Warhawk. That could be a little bit controversial in the moment when we're renaming everything. A Warhawk? I don't know about that. So that could be off limits, Ryan. I'm not sure. Okay, did you play sports at Arrowhead?
I did, yes. I played ice hockey principally. I was a goaltender for the ice hockey team. I also played lacrosse and I ran track. I was a distance runner for a while.
Wow, what was your distance?
I did the 500 and the mile. The 800 rather, and the mile. I was not particularly competitive on the state level. I never got my times down to those numbers that were super competitive on the state level. But I still enjoy a good jog around Washington.
What in your prime? What would you say your best mile time was?
It was something like in the low 5 minutes, I think.
Oof, that's moving. What do you need to be competitive statewide in Wisconsin?
Oh, we had some. Arrowhead has tremendous athletic talent, so we had folks who were running in, I think, the high 4 minutes or maybe even 4:30. So yeah, there were some really talented kids at the varsity level. So it's a big high school. There's a lot of talent.
So you left Wisconsin for Georgetown, like the great Brian Style before you. Were you in the SFS program or the Walsh School, or what was your major? You may have already mentioned this.
I was in the college. I studied government and theology. All of my friends liked to note that those two things don't mix, religion and politics. I always like to retort that I was trying to receive a knowledge of the highest things through science and through faith. So I think that they complemented each other quite well.
And then, okay, so you intern on the Hill with Paul Ryan and others. And so towards the end of your college experience, take me through your transition after that? What did you do?
So I worked on the 2010 Scott Walker campaign in between undergraduate and graduate school. I think you also were on that campaign, if I'm not mistaken.
No,
you were on later campaigns.
I came home to knock on doors during the recall. I worked for his presidential campaign later on. I moved back in 2015. So I was
Right.
still on
Okay.
active duty in 2010.
Right, right. Okay, I'm getting my campaigns mixed up here because there
There
were
was a
so
lot
many
of
of them.
there was a lot
There
of
were so many of them. I was on the original, the OG Walker
courage.
campaign in 2010. So there was the primary against Mark Newman, and then the general against Mayor Barrett. And then went on to graduate school over in the UK at Oxford University. That was sort of my foray into international living. So the
Were you on a
adventurous.
Fulbright?
I was on a scholarship through the Department of Politics and International
Okay.
Relations. The Fulbright scholarship came later. I did that in my PhD time, and that was in Brazil actually. That wasn't in the UK. But that was my first sort of foray into international living after I had been bitten by the foreign policy and political science bug. And so spent a number of years in the UK doing graduate study and eventually a PhD.
And what was the subject of your dissertation?
So I wrote on the importance of virtues to liberal politics, small L liberal politics. So traditionally, democratic type of politics, particularly the virtue of courage. And I examined that virtue within the political thought of three thinkers in particular, Alexis de Tocqueville, John Stuart Mill, and Hannah Arendt. And I was asking the question, can this ancient virtue of courage be brought into the modern world as a principal political virtue? And the answer, I think, is yes. It not only can be brought into the modern world, but it must be. And so I'm particularly proud of the thesis. I think it has a sort of enduring quality to it that is relevant even more so now than it was in 2017 and 2018 when I was finishing it.
Well, there is my favorite monument in Green Bay besides the statue of Vince Lombardi is a tiny little rock, for lack of a better term, with a plaque on it that commemorates when de Tocqueville came to Green Bay. There's some claim by UWGB that that's the furthest west he ever got. I'm not sure that's true, or I've never looked into it, but it's just a remarkable reminder of, I think, in my mind, that Green Bay and Northeast Wisconsin represents a lot of what de Tocqueville talked about as the source of strength in America. But what does de Tocqueville have to tell us about courage itself?
Yeah, I can imagine that's a pretty interesting monument, and I can only imagine what he experienced at the time
It's probably
in
cold.
pretty much wilderness, battling mosquitoes and observing extremely local politics, small town governance at its finest. What de Tocqueville says about courage, he says that in America it has been tempered, particularly by business and by economic interests. And so this virtue that we often associate with sort of violence and the art or the act of war had actually been brought into the economic sphere by Americans. And so what would be in an aristocratic society, people risking their life to prove their honor or to achieve glory on a battlefield was instead put into economic pursuits. And so he has a bunch of passages about how Americans, brave the seas more than aristocratic Europeans do because they would like to get to port on the other side 2 or 3 days before their counterparts. And he sees great courage in this sort of entrepreneurial activity. And so one of the really interesting insights that he has is that Americans had brought courage into the economic sphere and thereby sort of tempered it from its very sort of aristocratic overtones of war.
Interesting. So is there like a big academic debate out there or philosophical debate about the nature of courage or its definition? Like, did you pick fights with anybody in the literature?
Well, I actually went a little broader than that. There's a lot of literature out there about so-called liberal virtues. Again, small L, liberal for our listeners. whether democracy is requiring certain virtues that perhaps it doesn't produce naturally, when it focuses too much on the individual and not enough on the community, focuses on sort of Lockean individual rights. And there's a whole debate and a whole literature out there on liberal virtues. And so I situated my dissertation within that literature. And again, the pet virtue that I focused on was courage, because I thought it was the most important of the virtues. As Churchill said, without courage, you don't have any of the other virtues. That's why it's the most central one.
I'd be interested, from a Catholic perspective, I've been taught that there are other virtues more supreme than courage. But I would say courage is probably connected in my mind with the virtues of magnanimity or commitment to a cause higher than yourself, and humility, right? If nothing else, raw physical courage must be tempered by the occasional humility. But I don't know the literature on this like you. I'm just a weird presidential decision-making guy.
Sure. I mean, well, I think first comes the definition of courage that I offered in the thesis, which is not an overly Spartan one. It's not that, at least in the war context, we always have to jump into the battle, and if we don't jump into battle, we're not being courageous. We're being cowardly. I think the definition of courage has to be well-rounded enough that there's space for such thing as foolhardiness, right? Someone who jumps into something too early or foolishly in a situation where success is just so far from possible that it would be foolish to do so. And so courage, I think, properly defined, is actually the proper response to threats that pose threats that are directly opposed to things that we hold dear. And so when we're acting with courage, we actually shed light on things that we truly care about as well. We show our priorities, so to speak. But courage isn't always jumping into the fray. It can also mean sitting on the sidelines if the possibility of defeat is just so overwhelming that it would be foolish to do so.
So for the young Wisconsinites out there who are listening and thinking about pursuing a PhD, what in your mind, how would you advise them on the difference between the British system and the American system?
Good question. So when you went through and did your PhD, you probably had a lot of teaching requirements. You probably had a whole master's degree beforehand. You had your comprehensive exams after your 2 years in the program. For the British program, a lot of times you come already with a master's, and so they're happy to have you jump into PhD study right away. And it's more of a research-based degree. So there are plenty of opportunities to teach, of course, but you're not required to do so as part of your degree. It's purely based on, you pass the degree purely based on research. And so your goal in 3 or 4 years of writing is to get a PhD dissertation, pretty much book-length manuscript, ready for an individual 3-hour grilling defense.
And how intense is the 3-hour grilling defense?
It shouldn't, in theory, it should be intense, but it shouldn't be too adversarial, because if your supervisor has properly prepared you, you're ready to go. To a certain extent, if you do a PhD dissertation, you should be an expert on your topic, and you should know your topic even better than your assessors, because you've spent 3 or 4 years reading that literature very specifically, very, very uniquely. And so it should be challenging, but it shouldn't be too adversarial. And, if your supervisor has prepared you well, you should never fail your dissertation defense.
Okay, so you finish your PhD, you come back to America. Take us through the circuitous path that leads you to where you are now, AEI.
Yeah, so I'm interested in political theory, as we've just discussed for the last 10 to 15 minutes, but I'm also, I had been bitten by this foreign policy bug. And what was interesting about what I studied is I think it could be fit under this really broad umbrella of what we would call governance. How do we get to good governance? Everything from virtues required for good politics, for good political leadership, to the way that criminal groups, threats that emanate from regions like Latin America, how criminal groups use governance to control the territories where they operate, in the spaces that they operate, and how they buy off the loyalties, for example, of the communities over whom they rule. That all kind of fits under the broad umbrella of governance. And for me, it was not only a linguistic match because I spoke Spanish and Portuguese to study Latin America, but it was also that aspect that there just seemed to be so many governance challenges in Latin America that it was a natural fit with my political theory instincts. And so I think I look at questions of foreign policy sometimes through that lens of a political theorist. I'm looking at things like corruption and institutions, institutional quality, basic aspects of governance and service provision, things that groups do, Mexican cartels, Brazilian gangs, for example, things that they do on the ground to buy off the loyalties of their local populations. It's fascinating stuff.
How long were you in Brazil on the Fulbright?
Collectively, I've lived in Brazil for almost 2 years. The Fulbright was a 1-year experience. But the great part about doing a PhD is that after you've met a certain number of years of residence, you're free to go. You're free to do field research. You're free to write from other parts of the world. In fact, it's quite, I think, healthy to break away from, especially a university town like Oxford, where there's just so much going on. That there are constant distractions because there are amazing lectures, there are people coming to town, and you know, it's nice to break away and find some seclusion where you can have a contemplative space to finish up your manuscript. And so for me, that was sort of Central Europe and Latin America, where I was able to find the solace to finish this thing up, partly in Brazil and partly in Slovenia.
Interesting. Because I don't think of Brazil in my mind as a place for contemplation, more of a place for, you know, everyone's enjoying life. And well, I mean, what's Brazil like? I've never been. I tried to go once, but the visa requirements were too onerous, and I gave up.
The good thing is that now President Bolsonaro has lifted visa requirements for American citizens to come to Brazil under the closer relationship that we have with the Brazilians. President Trump and President Bolsonaro like each other very much, and so it should be easier for you to go next time. Brazil is a wonderful country. It's extremely large. It's as diverse as the United States. Racially, it might even be more diverse than the United States. The number of different cultures and countries who have sent immigrants to Brazil is truly fascinating. Again, one of the few countries on the planet to which I can compare it is the United States, because there are just so many different regions, different cuisines, different music, even different regional dialects and accents that it's really difficult to generalize about what Brazil is. But most Americans, if they go to Rio, they go to Sao Paulo, maybe they go a little bit further south where there are some really nice beaches, and so they get that experience of Brazil, which is to say a wonderful experience full of culture and life, and what you just described, people really enjoying themselves and knowing how to live life.
Okay, so I don't even know where to begin our discussion of Latin America in general. Well, maybe we begin because I've received numerous complaints that I'm focused myopically on Indo-PACOM, that I've abandoned my former region and area of expertise of CENTCOM in the Middle East, and I've paid almost no attention to our own continent and Latin America in particular. But maybe we should just start with the geography of all of this, right? And the basic recognition that geopolitically speaking, with an emphasis on the geo, America is in an exceedingly enviable position in terms of the neighbors that we have and the miles of ocean we have between us and our adversaries. Would you agree with that basic sort of point?
I would, to a certain extent. I think that we're very lucky to have very Pacific neighbors with whom we trade on a very deep level, especially through the new trading arrangement of the USMCA. We have the longest unguarded border in the world with Canada, and there are basically no problems there. We have Mexico to our south, with whom we're deeply economically integrated. We have a region that's by and large mostly democratic, with some few very notable and important exceptions. And we have peace and economic integration for the most part. So one of the reasons why I think the United States has neglected Latin America and the Western Hemisphere in general is because there just aren't the same level of threats emanating from the region as there are from, say, the Middle East or the shiny newness of Asia. But that neglect has allowed for a specific number of threats to arise in our own shared hemisphere with Latin American countries. We have a criminal regime in Venezuela that is complicit in large drug trafficking organizations that are sending lots of product to the United States, contributing to the largest humanitarian catastrophe ongoing in the world right now. We've got 5.2 million Venezuelan refugees spread around the region, many of whom are actually in the United States now. We have a Cuban regime that is still not democratic, also involved in a lot of the transnational illicit activity. We've got a Nicaraguan regime that's hardening its autocracy. Even in countries like Mexico, there are grave security threats that pose a significant challenge to the state. I don't know if you saw a few weeks ago, but on Twitter there was a trending a video of the cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, which is the largest and fastest growing cartel in Mexico, showcasing some of their weapons. And if you weren't looking closely and you couldn't tell that they were cartel members, you would have thought that they were U.S. Marines. That they were so hardened, they had such military equipment at their disposal that this is a significant threat to regional stability and to the future of the Mexican state. I would even go as far as to say it's a threat to the existence of the Mexican state.
Wow. Well, let's maybe take each of those in turn. Venezuela has obviously captured a lot of attention with what's been going on over the past year, or a sort of sporadic attention, and then has receded back into a lower priority. What is the state of play in terms of our approach as the American government in this administration to Venezuela? What is the effort that Elliot Abrams is leading, and just what is your sense of where things go from here? And what was up with this failed coup attempt? I mean, that's what you need to unpack this for me. I thought it was a Netflix movie when I first heard about it.
Right. You thought it was featuring John Krasinski.
Yeah.
Sure. So we'll get to the failed coup attempt, but for our listeners, I think I'll start with a brief history here. In May of 2018, there was a deeply fraudulent election in Venezuela, essentially stolen by the dictator there, Nicolas Maduro, who was the handpicked successor of the late Hugo Chavez. The United States and the region.
Can I quick ask? What is his just level? I know it's impossible to get good data from these opaque and autocratic regimes, but relative to his predecessor, what is his level of popularity? How is he viewed among the people? As just someone to be feared, or does he have some base of support that's genuine? Sorry to interrupt.
I think that he has some base of support that is still genuine, but I think it's falling precipitously. We have to remember he's presided over one of the largest economic contractions in world history outside of war. So this definitely digs into the base that your predecessor built for you through a populist presidency, through an authoritarian populist presidency. So I think the base has really been waning as the country has fallen into economic catastrophe. And it's difficult to poll inside of a country like Venezuela, but the best estimates that I've seen is that he maintains a base of support of around 15 or 20% of the populace. So hardened, supporters of Maduro and Chavismo, the so-called ideology of former President Hugo Chavez, people who are truly loyal to the regime. But that number has really fallen with the economic decline of the country.
Is it a coherent ideology, or is it just a reflexive obeisance to a strongman ideology?
Well, I think under Chavez it probably had a little bit more form to it. I think now it's a little bit more amorphous. It's just it is sort of backward looking instead of forward looking. As I mentioned, this is a criminal regime. It exists on the basis of its participation in several illicit markets and illicit economies. It doesn't exist for the Venezuelan people. And it controls people and their votes through things like food handouts, where you're going to get what's called Carnet de la Patria, a patriot card or a fatherland card. And if you voted for the right party, and for our listeners, I'm doing air quotes here, right party, you will get food distributed to you by the government. Conveniently, many of the food distribution centers are right next to the polling places when it comes to election time. So it's difficult to say, on what basis this support rests, but the support is there in small numbers, let's say about 15 or 20%. So after the U.S. and the international community recognized a fraudulent election in May of 2018, we were thinking about ways to address this situation and the growing involvement of the Maduro regime in criminal activities in the Western Hemisphere. In 2019, the democratically elected National Assembly, really the only institution remaining in the country that hadn't been taken over yet by the Maduro regime, used a specific provision of the Venezuelan Constitution, Article 233, to say that if the presidency is unoccupied, specifically because there's nobody there who is either acting legitimately or had been elected legitimately, then the leader ex officio of the country is the Speaker of the National Assembly. And that man is a man by the name of Juan Guaido. And so the United States was incredibly quick to recognize Juan Guaido as the new interim president of Venezuela. We got about 60 plus countries on board with that legal position. And we started speaking about the Maduro regime as a thing of the past. So we now refer to, in our diplomatic statements, the former Maduro regime, even though there is a sort of struggle for power right now. And so there are various moments throughout 2019 and 2020 when it looked like Guaido and his opposition movement, including the hundreds of thousands of people that he commanded in street protests, were really going to do this. They were really going to push the regime out. There were a number of protests, hundreds of thousands of people in Caracas demanding change. The United States embarked on a pretty ambitious sanctions campaign. We've got sanctions now on over 200 individuals and a number of entities that were used in this illicit activity: money laundering, illicit gold, weapons, human smuggling, and of course drug trafficking. And we've used that to try to sap up some of the resources of the regime and hope that they would that would be enough to lead to a political transition. Unfortunately, the Maduro regime has managed through foreign intervention, from help from the Chinese and from the Russians and from the Cubans, as well as a bit of infiltration of the opposition and moves to crack it, to crack its unity. They've managed to stay in power over the course of this year and a half long campaign. And so now, without going into the details of these various moments when it looked like the regime was on the ropes, we're at a critical moment again in U.S. policy, and this is where Elliot's role comes in. Elliot Abrams is the special representative for Venezuela, and now the special representative for Iran affairs at the State Department. they're going to have to decide how to approach upcoming elections for the National Assembly. As I mentioned previously, it's still the only legitimately elected body in the country. But upcoming elections in December of this year, under the Maduro regime, under some of the rules that it's put in place, basically make it impossible to have free and fair elections. And so the opposition has decided, most of the opposition has decided that its position is to boycott these elections. That means that Maduro will win these National Assembly seats because the opposition simply isn't going to compete. And so we're now in a position where the guy that we recognize as the legitimate president of Venezuela, the guy we invited, that President Trump invited to his State of the Union address in February of this year, he is probably not going to be in the same position that he's in now. And so the question will be, where do we go from here in terms of whom do we recognize as the legitimate president of the country? How do we continue helping the opposition pressure the regime if they no longer have their positions in the National Assembly? How do we achieve unity again within this group of individuals which have disparate interests and disparate ideologies, and some of whom are actually on the take by the regime?
And what would, just to go back to something you said about the support that Maduro has gotten from the Chinese, the Russians, and Cuba, what's been sort of the nature of that support? Has it been financial? Has it been military? A mix of everything? And who's been his most aggressive outside source of support?
So it really depends on the country. You've got the Cubans are really the linchpin here. The Cubans are very much experts in military intelligence. They've kept an internal security apparatus on the island for many decades now. So they're very much expert in sort of ferreting out any whiff of or hint of defection within the military ranks. And in fact, in 2007, Hugo Chavez, with the help of Fidel Castro, who was alive then, created something called the DGIM, which stands for the Directorate General of Military Intelligence. And it basically hovers above the Venezuelan military and basically inserts minders into the ranks of the Venezuelan military to ensure the loyalty of the armed forces to the ideology of Chavismo and to the regime. And so it's been very difficult to foment any sort of fractures within the security apparatus in Venezuela. That's been one of the biggest failings of our policy thus far. And a lot of it is owing to the fact that the Cubans are just so good at detecting any sort of whiff of defection and making people pay dearly for it. There are multiple reports of torture centers in Venezuela, families being used as collateral damage for people who defect. And so it's really a dangerous game if you're a military officer and you disagree with some of the human rights abuses that you're being asked to participate in. There's a high cost to pay if you say no. The Russians are there on the ground with about 400 or 500 security personnel. They are purportedly there to look after some of the weapons that they've sold to the Venezuelans over the years. The regime, starting back in the Chavez years, bought about $10 billion of Russian weapons. So we're talking about everything from Igla-S man-pads, shoulder-fired rockets that could in theory take down civilian airliners if within distance, all the way to anti-aircraft missiles. So some pretty basic small arms and some pretty significant weaponry as well. And the other bit of support that the Russians are giving to the Maduro regime is through taking their sanctioned oil. So that there were a lot of loans given by the Russians in years past, and the Venezuelans are paying them back in oil. And so they're skirting or openly flouting U.S. sanctions with Rosneft and with other Russian state-owned oil companies, and that's been a big boon as well to the regime. The Chinese, I think, are playing the long game. The Chinese are there just trying to get their money back. They've lent the regime. It's unclear, it's opaque, but they've lent the regime anywhere between 50 and 60 billion over the years, and so they as well are trying to get their money back, mostly with oil payments in kind. You've got all sorts of other actors that are there as well. Hezbollah has cells in Venezuela. Iran is doing a brisk trade with Venezuela. Turkey is taking illicit gold. The United Arab Emirates is also taking illicit gold from the mining region in Venezuela. So it's really a rogues gallery of criminals there in Venezuela. It's a lawless country.
It's like the Star Wars bar, the Mos Eisley Cantina of this hemisphere. Well, just on the subject of oil, in terms of financial pressure that we could bring to bear to effectuate our policy preferences, are there sanctions left that we haven't used? What more could we be doing in terms of economic pressure and suasion?
So there's not much runway left on the oil front. We have gone after PDVSA, which is the acronym that stands for the Petróleos de Venezuela. It's the state-owned oil company there that controls all of the oil activity. So we've really taken a bite out of Venezuela's oil exports. And it's important, I think, for listeners to know that Venezuela is an oil economy. It has the largest proven reserves in the world, even larger than Saudi Arabia. And it's 95 to 98% oil-based. And so we've taken a huge chunk out of their economy by sanctioning their state-owned oil company and by going after, with secondary sanctions, companies, even European companies, who are still working with the regime. And so the regime has gone from, during the Chavez years, producing more than 3 million barrels a day to last month's figures, which just came out yesterday, about 400,000 to 450,000 barrels per day. So we've seen Venezuela go through sanctions, but also through mismanagement, lack of investment of profits back into equipment and knowledge and skills, and also corruption on an unfathomable scale. We've seen it go from about 3 to 3.5 million barrels of oil per day, a net exporter, to about 400 or 450,000 barrels of oil per day production. A country that needs significant imports to be able to meet its daily needs. So we've taken a significant chunk out of that sector of the economy. What is keeping the regime afloat is these illicit markets, the illicit economy in which they are participating very heavily. So the drug trafficking, the multi-billion-dollar per year industry of illicit gold mining, these things are much more difficult to get after with sanctions because by their very nature, they're illicit. They're not out there in the open where we know the accounts, we know the people involved, we know the companies involved. It's very difficult. And gold in particular is one of those industries where it's very easy to launder and hide the origins of illicit gold. So once you take the product out of the ground, you can basically smelt it. You can basically erase any element of where it was mined in the first place. And then you can also use unscrupulous business owners to write you fake certificates of origin. And so all of a sudden you have gold that was mined in Venezuela, for example, being marketed to the international gold market as gold that was mined in a legal mine in Colombia or in Brazil or in any other country. And it's very difficult to detect that gold was in fact mined in Venezuela. And so what we've seen is a tripling of the so-called Arco Minero, which is this section of gold mining belt in Venezuela over the last year, because this is really the crux of Maduro's financing is illicit gold. Anywhere between $2 and $4 billion in criminal activity last year, and I think at the end of 2020 we're going to see that number explode. And these are areas where there is significant human rights abuses going on. There are criminal gangs which basically keep control in this region. Allegedly, Hezbollah is involved in this illicit gold activity, and so it's also profiting. on this economic region and in bed with the regime. So there's a really toxic mix of things going on in Venezuela, and I think it presents a really unique threat in the Western Hemisphere to the United States.
Well, if our official policy position, I don't know if the administration has put it in these terms, but is Maduro must go, and indeed Guaido is the legitimate leader of the country. What other tools do we have at our disposal? What other instruments have we not used that we might look at using?
So one thing that we've just started to roll out was criminal indictments, basically keeping members of the regime from traveling, lest they have an Interpol notice put out on their name and lest they be arrested. Criminal indictments can certainly help to peel individuals away from the inner circles of the regime, possibly cooperating with U.S. law enforcement. Basically, you have to look at it as a sort of criminal cabal at the top, and you have to use, I think, tactics that are similar to trying to break a criminal mafia. So you try to peel members away one at a time, and you slowly, create the fissures necessary that eventually, a few people on the inside help someone like Guaido foment the democratic transition that the U.S. has hoped for a long time. So criminal indictments are one of those options. More sanctions. I think that there hasn't been enough regional and international robust diplomacy. So in my opinion, the Europeans are really behind on the Venezuela front. They've done sanctions on only like 20 individuals. Meanwhile, we've done more than 200. So I think they need to catch up there. I think that countries like Spain have an interest in not allowing their country to become a Chavista playground, as I've mentioned to several members of the Spanish political elite before, and they agree. It's just a matter of finding the political will, and the U.S. using its diplomatic tools to nudge them in the right direction. I think that there just hasn't been enough. There hasn't been enough diplomatic activity to form a really robust response from the international community. There's all sorts of ideas about dialogue with the regime and negotiations for better election conditions and certain things that, if done poorly, risk legitimizing the regime in a highly stage-managed election.
And perhaps we agree that there's just no appetite in the United States for a more robust set of options, particularly any sort of regime change by military force. But that did not stop an enterprising group of private military contractors from attempting to take matters into their own hands. I believe this was called Operation Gideon. Am I right?
Yeah, so I mentioned we would get to the so-called coup attempt, and that comes in May of this year. There was an enterprising group of both Americans and Venezuelans, many of whom were in Colombia.
To bring it back to what de Tocqueville loved about Americans, here we have a great example.
Right. Although this is unfortunately a plan that was so poorly designed and executed that there was nothing it could do but fail. And they were this enterprising group of individuals was not only infiltrated by the Cubans and by the Venezuelan regime, and so they had the knowledge that this was coming, but also they were organized over the border in Colombia by a regime official who had been in Colombia, had decided to break ties with the Maduro folks, a general by the name of Cleaver Alcalá. And Cleaver Alcalá was actually wanted by the United States, and after this coup attempt was actually taken in by the United States. And so the State Department line was that we may have had knowledge, in fact, that conversations were happening, but we had no role to play whatsoever in in these individuals attempting what they attempted, which was a maritime incursion into Venezuela with around 50 men or fewer. The plan was to, with the help of some former Green Berets, to make a maritime incursion on small boats and to head straight into Caracas and essentially take out Nicolas Maduro, even in the presidential palace, if that's what was necessary. And as I mentioned, the plot was infiltrated from the start, and so the Venezuelans were waiting for these rafts to arrive, and they made a complete. They made the United States and the Venezuelan opposition look completely foolish, because later it surfaced that interim President Guaido had conversations with some of the folks who were involved in setting up this plot, and so it looked as if, even if it wasn't, it looked as if there was a sort of stamp of approval on this operation, which again was not very well thought out and was even more poorly executed. And so the serious matter of it is the following. Maduro still holds political prisoners who were involved in this plot, including a number of former Green Berets from the United States. And so the question is, what is he going to demand of the United States to get those what are essentially now hostages, to get those folks back, because the United States needs to work to get them back, and also needs to work to get other hostages back as well. There are folks who were working for the company Citgo, for example, who were held by the Maduro regime. They were lured to Caracas for fake meetings and then arrested by the intelligence services. So, this is just another problem that we have to challenge, that we have to resolve, in addition to finding ways to make the opposition, relevant and fully supported again in this environment. So it's another headache that we have to deal with, unfortunately, these political prisoners.
Basically, all we've succeeded in doing, or they've succeeded, because you're not suggesting that this was actually orchestrated by the U.S. government, or at least there's no evidence to suggest that there was support provided. But all that these individuals have succeeded in doing is handing Maduro leverage over the United States.
In my opinion, yes. I don't think that the United States government was involved. The State Department was very quick, as I mentioned, to disavow any connection to these failed plots. And everything that's come out since then has indicated that we in no way financed nor really encouraged these individuals to do what they did. But as far as who knew what when, I don't have all of the information. But when it comes to financing and encouragement, I don't think the United States government was doing either of those things.
And you joked about this before, but this is eerily similar to the plot of the second season of Jack Ryan on Amazon Prime Video, like eerily similar to it.
Yeah, and certain people who study Venezuela as well were making analogies, of course, to the failed Bay of Pigs invasion. And so this was referred to, I think, derisively by quite a number of people as the Bay of Piglets. So because it had so many similarities in the nature of the plan, i.e. a maritime incursion and a sort of assassination in a plot, go straight to the head of the regime. So it was for a short time dubbed the Bay of Piglets.
Well, now we're in a pickle, though, because we got to get these guys back. I mean, particularly, they served our country. And I mean, I don't know. I think Elliot is a very smart guy. I assume we're considering a variety of options here, but it's hard for me to see an easy path forward if I combined the effects of the Bay of Piglets with what you laid out with the upcoming election. Give us some optimistic news in Venezuela. Is there any glimmer of hope that we can see on the horizon?
It's pretty difficult to find optimistic points in Venezuela. Unfortunately, I think the humanitarian catastrophe is what is going to continue unabated. People are going to continue leaving the country as they can't find a legitimate livelihood in Venezuela. The average salary in Venezuela, monthly salary, is something like $4 US. And the regime, with its socialistic ideology, is committed to price fixing, to mandating prices. But unfortunately, the minimum wage in Venezuela is not enough to buy so much as a piece of meat or a carton of eggs. And so, a lot of people are barely subsisting. For all intents and purposes, the US dollar has become the currency, and euros to a lesser extent in Venezuela, because no one trusts the bolivar. In some instances, you could go to the market in the morning and pay one thing for a piece of food, and then go back in the afternoon and pay exponentially more. That's how quickly hyperinflation unfolds. And so I wish I could be more optimistic about Venezuela, but unfortunately, right now it's pretty dark times for the country, and that's why it's really imperative for the United States to retool, to rethink its Venezuela policy, to assess sanctions at this point, what they've succeeded in doing, and then places where we can sort of tighten the net that we've set around the regime, and also think about sanctions. And there's got to be something that comes after sanctions, because clearly sanctions haven't been enough to be able to contribute to a political transition against this very hardened criminal regime. So I think, regardless of whether President Trump emerges victorious in November and begins a second term, or if we have a transition to a Joe Biden administration, the U.S. president and his foreign policy apparatus is going to have a serious rethink about the future of U.S. policy towards Venezuela.
Well, as a former Middle East analyst, let me just console you by saying it's always darkest before it gets pitch black, which is what John McCain was fond of saying. Well, okay, we probably don't have enough time to talk about Nicaragua or Mexico. So I wonder if, because I want to leave 5 minutes for some more fun stuff. I wonder if you might touch briefly just on how you view coronavirus affecting the region. I would assume it sort of will just intensify economic problems that predated the pandemic, but are there any governments that have done better than others? What's just your kind of take on, because I feel like we tend to just ignore what's happening in Latin America with respect to coronavirus.
Yeah, it's a really varied mix in the region. Some countries like Brazil are second in case numbers, caseloads behind the United States. Other countries like Mexico aren't much further behind. And then there have been other countries who have had pretty robust responses to the coronavirus. And so some countries in Central America have done reasonably well. Peru was a country that was doing fairly well for a while, and then experienced a second wave, particularly when individuals decided to leave Lima, the capital city, and go to the hinterlands because they thought it was safer there. They ended up spreading a lot of virus along the way, and so Peru is now living through this second wave. Colombia was doing fairly well and is now, unfortunately, experiencing a second wave. The WHO in May of this year declared that Latin America was the new epicenter of the coronavirus, and that it represented something like 40 or 45% of the overall number of cases in the world. And so this is a region that's been hit pretty hard on the broad regional writ large. The region has been really hit hard, and we're talking about an economic contraction that's going to hit a region that was already one of the slowest growing in the world. Very frustrating levels of economic growth if you study Latin America. It seems like Some of these countries just can't find the ability to get moving. So stuck in sort of low cycles of economic growth, 1.5%, 2% growth, when developing economies should be growing at a much faster rate, especially developing economies, many of whom have free trade agreements with the United States. They have, pretty much tariff-based, tariff-free access to the United States economy. And so the coming coronavirus economic recession is going to be particularly deep in the region, and I worry about the effects of that deep, long contraction on the politics of the region. Perhaps more populism, perhaps more fringe candidates, perhaps more candidates willing to not just to upend the establishment, but to upend regional norms, and to partner with potentially with adversaries of the United States in our own shared neighborhood. Now, for the upside, I think that there is an upside here, and I think the United States has to capitalize on it. I mentioned already at the beginning of the pod that we're very economically integrated with countries like Mexico through our free trade agreements. I think the desire is pretty broad-based throughout the region for further integration with the United States. And we have this amazing opportunity right now where many companies want to do what's called nearshoring. They want to bring their supply chains out of Asia, particularly out of China, and bring them to a more secure hemisphere that might not be subject to not only frequent viruses, but also the predatory practices of the Chinese Communist Party. And so I think it makes total sense to be very encouraging of companies that want to set up shop in Mexico, in Central America, in South America, because together the economic integration is what's going to help us grow out of this pandemic recession. And I think we have that opportunity now when a lot of companies are going through this rethink about what their supply chains will look like. Look, economically, it makes a lot of sense. If you've got industry in Mexico, for example, you can bring your product to the United States in 2 or 3 weeks less time, and for about $2,000, $3,000, or even $4,000 cheaper if you're putting it in a cargo container than if you have to ship from China. So I think the average amount of time to ship from China is something like 3 or 4 weeks. Costs more than $4,000 per cargo container. That's down to about 1,500 or so, and 1 week's time if you want to ship a product industry from Mexico. So it makes economic sense and it makes supply chain sense because you're building slack then into your supply chain. You're no longer running a just-in-time, so-called just-in-time supply chain. But you've actually got some maneuverability in case something affects your supply chain. So my hope moving forward is that the United States and its partners in Latin America will capitalize on this opportunity to further our economic partnerships and integration with the interest of making them more secure.
That is a big idea that I quite like. I do think the desire for some form of selective decoupling from China is widespread, bipartisan, and will continue almost regardless of what happens politically in November. And the challenge is to do it smartly, right? Don't sort of go towards full-on autarky, but jujitsu it into closer relationship with our partners and allies. There's also an unexplored opportunity, I think, that Ovik Roy and some others have written about in terms of nearshoring of drug manufacturing in Puerto Rico and things like that. So we may need to have you back to talk about that, Nicaragua, and all the other things we glossed over. State failure in Mexico, TCOs. But in the few minutes we have remaining, I want to ask about some more lowbrow things. Do you make time to read fiction, or are you all obscure philosophy and Latin American data all the time?
Lesser and lesser of it, but I still do enjoy a good novel from time to time. I think especially when I'm noticing that my writing and my analysis is getting pretty dry. I need to spice it up a little bit by reading some good fiction. That's usually when I pick up a fiction book and try to build on my vocabulary and my sentence structure and to get out of that really dry writing phase.
What about, and be honest about this, do you have any Netflix addictions or movies that you've watched during the pandemic that you're afraid to admit, but you will right now?
My wife and I have been watching some pretty serious stuff, to be honest. So I won't mention things like Narcos because that's just too, it's just so cliche, but also it's like right in my wheelhouse professionally. But we've watched a number of really interesting documentaries. We also have watched a couple of series that we really liked. There was a Swedish series called Caliphate that we enjoyed in particular.
Wow.
I think it did a really great job of showing some of the networks on the ground that terrorist groups use to try to recruit disaffected youth in Western countries. So a really amazing, suspenseful series called Caliphate. There was another series that we watched, short series called Unorthodox, about Orthodox Jewish community in Brooklyn, which was sort of a very eye-opening short series for us. So some pretty interesting stuff that we otherwise probably wouldn't have watched, but now that we're working from home and doing Netflix when we have free time, we ended up watching.
In the spirit of Narcos, what is the best movie or TV show that's been made about drug trafficking in general, but maybe certain South America or Central America in particular? I'm trying to think. Narcos is good. City of God is good, right? About
Narcos
Brazil.
is good. City of God is very good. The novel, if you want to pick up some fiction by Paulo Lins, is a particularly good novel as well. There are plenty of English translations available. It's based on the author's personal experience growing up in a favela in Brazil. I think Al Pacino has probably starred in a number of good movies. I think Scarface is a pretty classic one about a Miami-based drug dealer based on a true story, if I'm not mistaken. So I think that's probably the most classic one that wouldn't be sort of like Narcos.
Well, this reminds me of a huge pet peeve I have, which is Sicario, which is a really good movie, I thought, but I'm a sucker for action movies like that. They did a sequel to Sicario called Day of the Soldado, and if you watch it, it's very apparent that the movie starts off with a plot based on the nexus of drug cartels and terrorist groups in the United States. But then at some point along the way, they realized that that was just too politically sensitive or playing into like a right-wing narrative. And the movie just completely veers off in a different direction, and it makes absolutely no sense. So you don't have to comment on that, but I just would appreciate if AEI would get to the bottom of why Sicario, Day of the Soldado was so disappointing, because I'm obsessed with it.
I saw the original Sicario. I thought it was pretty good. That's the one with Benicio del Toro, right?
Yes.
Yeah. A very, very good film. I haven't seen the sequel, but it sounds like I'm not missing much.
No, but you need to watch it to tell me if I'm on point with my instincts here.
All
this
right.
was Hollywood self-censoring because of political correctness. And if any of the producers or the actors want to come on this podcast and prove me wrong, they're welcome to at any point. Do you read Spanish authors? Like, do you have favorite Spanish authors? Like, are you a Gabriel Garcia Marquez guy? Are you I'm trying to remember. I was a Latin American studies major for a year and then I forgot everything.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's very good, I think, to keep your linguistic skills sharp, and reading is something that's very important to that, especially to build vocabulary. I often work every day in Spanish and Portuguese when I'm reading primary sources, but it's important, I think, to keep a vocabulary that's beyond a sort of technical political vocabulary. And so sometimes, I can say all these things like, very specific technical words, and then, the type of rich vocabulary you'd need on a day-to-day basis is a little rusty when it comes back to speaking because you haven't read novels in a while. So Marquez is something that's definitely recommended for Spanish speakers out there. Mario Vargas Llosa from Peru, where I've also lived. Particularly, he's from the city where I used to live in Peru, called Arequipa, in the south. He's a very good author. I often enjoy Borges if I want to read some Argentine, and I also like Pablo Neruda, who is the famous Chilean poet. I think he has some great poems, particularly in the first set of poems he wrote, which were love songs and a song of despair. And so those are translated into English as well. For those listeners who want to go and grab a copy of that, you can find most of them online, I imagine.
Those are great recommendations. Reminded me, when I was in college, I did a summer in Europe and backpacked around and wound up in Spain. And my best friend in college was there for a week at the same time I was, and we went from Santander down to Madrid. I know this is not the same as South America, but in order to further our Spanish studies, which is what Princeton wanted us to do, we of course went to go see a movie in Spanish, and the two options were Spider-Man 2, Spider-Man 2, and Yo Robot, which is I, Robot, the great Will Smith movie. So whenever I see I, Robot, I think of Yo Robot. That's the extent of my Spanish these days. Okay, Ryan, penultimate question. Who would you consider your mentors throughout your career, and how important has mentorship been to you?
Well, I have benefited tremendously from a number of mentors over the years. I think mentorship is one of the most important things and qualities in becoming a leader, and then hopefully once you get there to paying it back to those who are looking for it. So starting with Paul Ryan, someone I mentioned earlier in the pod, has been very good to me and has been a mentor over the years, all the way to folks at the State Department, who have mentored me from when I interned there. A fellow named Giovanni Sneidel, who's the senior coordinator for Western Hemisphere security in the WHA office in State, all the way to my current boss at AEI, Roger Noriega, who's the former Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs and a former ambassador to the OAS, and even my ultimate boss at AEI, Corey Shockey, the new head of Foreign and Defense Policy Studies. They've all been good mentors and spent a lot of time, working with me and talking about my professional development. And I'm very grateful for the time they've taken with me, and I look forward to paying it back in the future to all those who work under me as well.
So with that in mind, when you come back to Wisconsin and we're grabbing a beer and a kid comes up to you, a young Wisconsinite, and says, Ryan, I've been reading your work. I'm a huge fan of it. It's really inspired me to pursue a career in foreign policy, potentially get a PhD. What advice would you have for that young Wisconsinite?
Keep at it. Keep practicing your writing skills. That's one of the most important things that I think the American education system really neglects. We're living in a digital world, but I think the written word still really matters. Being able to condense complex ideas and distill them for a common audience who might not be well versed in your subject areas is very important. So writing skills, especially for that PhD trajectory, I think the most important thing that you can hone, and just read, really just read as much as you can. You've got to be, I think, a voracious reader to finish a PhD successfully. And if you're not reading widely, you don't really know what your region and focus of study is going to be. You might end up down a path that you don't want to be. But for those who are looking to to do the PhD. It's going to take a lot of perseverance. It's going to take a lot of soul searching. I don't know if it was the case for you, but it was certainly the case for me. There were many points along the way where, I could have stepped away. I could have decided that this wasn't for me, or that I just didn't feel like finishing. And you learn a lot about yourself. You learn a lot about what motivates you and what doesn't motivate you and what interests you when it's really just you're the only one that can get this manuscript to the finish line. Your supervisor can give you support and offer ideas and various avenues that he or she thinks are fruitful for you to explore, but it's really just up to you to get it to the finish line. So lots of personal initiative as well.
Great advice. To that, I would only add, do it in the British system, not the American system. Ryan, thank you so much for taking the time. Thank you for shedding light on Venezuela and a variety of other issues. And thanks for being a great example of Wisconsin in the world. Really appreciate it. Look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you very much, Congressman, for having me on the pod, and greetings to all of our fellow Wisconsinites.
It's gonna be your parents and my parents, the only ones listening. So see ya.
The